Victor Hale owned a super yacht, a private island, and a net worth most people can't pronounce. But on a rainy afternoon in his hometown, he saw an elderly woman in a faded green coat feeding stray cats outside a shelter. Something about her made his lungs seize. Inside, a worn intake file revealed her name, Rose, and her emergency contact, never called, was a nephew named Victor. The nephew she believed had died decades ago. For 27 years, Victor believed his mother abandoned him. That loss became fuel. He built a tech empire from a rented garage, chasing a void no amount of money could fill. The official story, fed by his aunt, was that Rose died overseas when he was a toddler. But on that rainy afternoon, a faded intake file told a different truth. Rose never left. She was institutionalized with early dementia, erased from his life by someone who was supposed to love them both. And the deeper Victor dug, the darker the betrayal became. Victor Hale had only 2 fragments of his mother. The first was a scent, lavender and warm bread, so faint he sometimes wondered if he'd invented it. The second was a sound, a woman's laugh, low and soft, vanishing before he could hold it. Everything else came from his Aunt Margaret. Margaret was his father's sister, a thin woman with clipped answers and a locked drawer of old photographs that Victor was never allowed to touch. When he asked about Rose, Margaret's face would tighten. "Your mother left," she'd say. "She wasn't cut out for family life." And then she'd turn back to her sewing, the conversation sealed shut. The official story was simple. Rose abandoned them when Victor was 2 years old, fled overseas with someone else, and died in a car accident somewhere in Spain before Victor turned 4. There was no grave to visit, no letters, nothing but that locked drawer and the silence that grew around it like a wall. Victor stopped asking by the time he was 10. But he never stopped carrying the belief that he was the kind of child even a mother could not love. That wound became his engine. At 18, he left his coastal hometown with a single duffel bag and a scholarship to a state university. He studied computer science in overcrowded lecture halls, taught himself to code in library basements after hours, and ate meals standing up, because time was money, and money was the only protection he trusted. By 25, he had founded a tech startup in a rented garage. By 30, his company was processing payments for half the online retailers in the country. By 43, Victor Hale owned a super yacht moored in Monaco, a private island in the Caribbean, and a net worth that financial magazines struggled to calculate. He had built an empire from nothing, driven by a relentless need to prove himself worthy of a past he never spoke about. But inside, he was still that boy staring at a locked drawer. The trip back to his hometown was meant to be a victory lap. Victor had announced a philanthropic foundation, the Hale Future Initiative, with a $10 million endowment focused on education and housing in the same neighborhoods where he'd grown up hungry. The press would be there, local officials, old teachers who'd believed in him. He hadn't visited in years. The city felt smaller, grayer, its streets narrower than his memory had preserved. A hired driver navigated the rental sedan through unfamiliar neighborhoods, while Victor reviewed notes on his tablet. Then the rain began. A sudden coastal downpour that blurred the roads and forced the driver to take a wrong turn. They ended up in a part of town Victor didn't recognize. A tired stretch of thrift stores, closed laundromats, and a weathered building with a faded sign, Harbor Women's Shelter. The driver muttered an apology and reached for the GPS. But Victor wasn't listening. Through the streaks of rain on the window, he saw an elderly woman standing near the shelter's entrance. She wore a faded green coat. Her gray hair was pinned back carelessly. She was breaking apart bread crusts and scattering them to a cluster of thin stray cats. Her movements were slow, deliberate, almost reverent. Something about the slope of her shoulders, the tilt of her head, made Victor's lungs seize. "Stop the car," he said. He stepped out into the rain without an umbrella. The woman didn't notice him at first. He stood at a distance, watching her hands, gnarled fingers tearing bread with a tenderness that made his chest ache. And then she turned slightly, and he saw her profile. It meant nothing. And it meant everything. He didn't know her face, but his body remembered something his mind had buried. Victor walked into the shelter. A tired-looking director named Mrs. Alvarez met him at the front desk, suspicious of his expensive coat, his quiet intensity. He asked about the woman in the green coat. Mrs. Alvarez hesitated, then led him to a cramped office and pulled a manila intake file from a cabinet. Rose has been with us almost 2 years now, she said carefully. Before that, she was in state facilities. Decades, actually. She has early dementia. She doesn't speak much. Victor opened the file. The name on the first page was Rose Hale. His hands began to tremble. And then he saw the emergency contact line, a name written in faded ink, a phone number that no longer existed, and a relationship word that made the room spin. Nephew, Victor, the emergency contact who had never been called, never been notified, never been told she was still alive. Victor stared at the page. Then he looked up at Mrs. Alvarez. "She's my mother," he said. And before Mrs. Alvarez could respond, she reached back into the file and pulled out something else. A photograph of a crumpled crayon drawing that had been found in Rose's coat pocket. A child's stick figure, labeled with a single name, Victor, saved every day she'd spent waiting. Mrs. Alvarez led Victor down a narrow hallway to the room where Rose slept. The shelter smelled of disinfectant and old coffee. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. In the corner of a small room with 3 cots, Rose sat on the edge of the nearest one, still wearing her faded green coat. She was humming something, a tune Victor almost recognized, like a radio signal from a station that no longer existed. He knelt in front of her. The movement was instinctive, as if his body knew what to do even while his mind was still drowning. "Rose," he said. She looked at him with hollow, unrecognizing eyes. Her hands continued to fidget with the hem of her coat. Victor's throat closed. He had prepared for anger, for tears, for accusations. He had not prepared for her to look through him like a stranger. Then she whispered, so quietly he almost missed it, "I always hoped you'd come." She reached into her coat and pulled out a crumpled crayon drawing, a stick figure with a round head and uneven arms, labeled in wobbly letters, Victor. The paper was soft from years of folding and unfolding, the edges worn white. She had carried it across decades, across facilities, across a life that had been stolen from both of them. Victor took the drawing with shaking hands. "I'm here," he said. "I'm here now." But Rose had already drifted back into her humming, her eyes fixed on something beyond the wall. Mrs. Alvarez touched his shoulder. "She has good days and bad days," she said gently. "This is one of the bad ones. She may not remember this conversation tomorrow." Victor stood slowly, the drawing pressed against his palm. "How long has she been in the system?" he asked. Mrs. Alvarez pulled out the intake file again and began to read. What emerged was a timeline that made Victor's stomach turn. Rose Hale had been admitted to her first state psychiatric facility at age 24, barely 2 years after Victor was born. The intake records listed her diagnosis as acute depressive disorder with psychotic features. But a handwritten note in the margin, added by a social worker years later, suggested something far more troubling. Patient shows no signs of psychosis. Appears confused, frightened, repeatedly asks for her son. Was brought in by sister-in-law. Victor's blood ran cold. Sister-in-law. Margaret, the woman who had raised him, who had told him his mother was dead, who had locked away the photographs and silenced every question, she had been the one to commit Rose. And she had done it when Victor was barely old enough to form memories. This was not abandonment. This was erasure. Mrs. Alvarez continued. Rose had been transferred between 5 different facilities over 27 years. Each transfer was initiated by the same person, Margaret Hale, acting as legal guardian. The file contained letters from Margaret, each one requesting that Rose be moved to a more secure facility, each one citing deteriorating condition and risk to herself and others. But the actual medical evaluations told a different story. They described a quiet, cooperative patient who gardened in the facility's courtyard, who helped fold laundry, who asked the same question at every new intake: "Where is my son?" Victor read the evaluations one by one. His mother had not been mentally ill in the way Margaret had claimed. She had been trapped, a young widow with a toddler, struggling with grief, perhaps with postpartum depression. And Margaret had used that vulnerability to lock her away and claim Victor as her own. But there was something else, something that made Victor's jaw tighten until it ached. Buried in the file was a legal document, a petition for guardianship over the estate of Rose Hale, filed by Margaret Hale, dated 4 months after Rose was institutionalized. Attached was a death certificate for Victor's father, who had died when Victor was an infant. And beneath that, a life insurance policy with a payout of $250,000 payable to the legal guardian of Victor Hale. Victor put the document down. His aunt had not just stolen his mother, she had stolen his inheritance. She had used his father's death as a funding source, collected $250,000, and spent the next 27 years ensuring Rose could never come back to claim what was hers. And every dollar she had spent raising Victor, the clothes, the school supplies, the meals, had come from the money meant for the woman she had locked away. But the cruelest detail was still waiting. Mrs. Alvarez hesitated before handing Victor the final page in the file, a letter from Rose herself, written in careful cursive on lined paper, dated 16 years ago. It was addressed to Victor, care of Margaret Hale. It had never been sent. "My dearest boy," it began. "I do not know if you will ever read this. The doctors here say I am sick, but I do not feel sick. I feel sad. I miss your father. I miss the way you used to hold my finger when you were learning to walk. Your aunt says you do not want to see me. She says you are ashamed of me. I try to understand. I try to be a good patient. But every night I dream of you. If you ever change your mind, I am here. I will always be here. Your loving mother." The words blurred in front of Victor's eyes. Margaret had not just silenced Rose. She had told Rose that Victor was the one who had rejected her. She had made a mother believe her own child was ashamed of her, while simultaneously telling that child his mother was dead. One lie split in two directions, designed to keep both victims so wounded they would never reach for each other. Victor looked up from the letter. "Where is my aunt now?" he asked. His voice was steady, but the calm was the kind that comes before a storm. Mrs. Alvarez checked the file. Margaret Hale is still listed as legal guardian on several of the older documents. She lives at the same address that's on file for your childhood home. She never moved. Of course she never moved. She had no reason to. She had the house, the money, the son who called her aunt and never asked the wrong questions. She had built a life on the foundation of someone else's motherhood. Victor returned to Rose's room. She was asleep now, curled on her side, the green coat still wrapped around her like armor. He sat beside her cot for a long time. He thought about the yacht in Monaco, the island in the Caribbean, the billions that had once seemed so important. He thought about the decade he had spent building an empire to fill a hole that was never supposed to exist. And then he thought about Margaret, sitting in that familiar house, surrounded by photographs he had never been allowed to touch. He pulled out his phone and called his attorney. "I need everything you can find on a woman named Margaret Hale. Guardianship records, financial records, property transfers, and I need to know if the statute of limitations has run out on fraud, unlawful imprisonment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress." His attorney paused. "Victor, who is Margaret Hale?" Victor looked at the sleeping woman beside him, at the crayon drawing still clutched in his hand. "The person who stole my mother," he said, "and I'm going to make sure she gives every single thing back." But what Victor didn't know yet was that Margaret had already heard he was in town, and she was already preparing her next move. The house on Cedar Street looked exactly as Victor remembered it. White siding faded to gray, porch steps that sagged in the middle, a front window where Margaret's cat always sat watching for strangers. He had not stood on this sidewalk since he was 17, the summer before college, when he had hugged his aunt goodbye and promised to make something of himself. Now, 2.5 decades later, he had made something, and it was all built on a lie. He knocked. The sound echoed in the quiet afternoon. No answer. He knocked again, harder. Then he tried the door. It was unlocked. Victor stepped inside. The smell hit him first. Lavender air freshener and old carpet, the same scent that had soaked into his childhood. The living room was unchanged. The same floral sofa. The same china cabinet with its display of teacups no one was allowed to touch. And on the mantel, a row of framed photographs. Photographs of Victor. School pictures, graduation, a newspaper clipping from when his company went public. Margaret had curated a shrine to the boy she had stolen, and there was not a single image of Rose anywhere in the room. Victor, the voice came from the hallway. Margaret Hale stood in the doorway to the kitchen, one hand braced against the frame. She looked older than he remembered, 72 now, her gray hair pulled into a tight bun, her eyes sharp but wary. She did not look surprised. "I heard you were in town," she said. "I figured you'd show up eventually." "You figured?" Victor's voice was flat. "You knew I'd find out." Margaret moved slowly to her armchair and sat, as if this were a social visit. "I knew you might stumble onto something, small towns talk. But I didn't think you'd go digging into the shelter. That was a mistake." Victor pulled the intake file from his coat and held it up. "The mistake was you thinking you could erase my mother and I'd never figure it out." Margaret's face tightened, but she did not flinch. "Your mother was a broken woman. She couldn't care for you. After your father died, she fell apart. I stepped in because someone had to. I gave you a home, an education, everything. I raised you as my own." "No." Victor stepped closer, his voice rising. "You buried her alive. You had her committed. You told everyone she was dead. And you used my father's insurance money to fund the whole thing. That's not raising me. That's theft." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. "The insurance money was for your care. I used it for your care." $250,000, Victor said. "Where did it go?" "Because I remember wearing second-hand clothes and eating government-subsidized school lunches. I remember you telling me we couldn't afford college visits." "Where did the money go, Margaret?" She looked away. That was when Victor understood the money was gone. Spent, siphoned, vanished into whatever life Margaret had secretly built while playing the selfless aunt. But before he could press further, his eye caught something on her desk near the hallway, a stack of legal papers with a county court letterhead. He crossed the room and grabbed them before she could stop him. "Victor, don't." He read the top page. It was a petition for permanent guardianship of Rose Hale, filed by Margaret Hale, dated 2 days ago. Attached was a doctor's affidavit claiming Rose was mentally incompetent, incapable of making decisions, and in need of full custodial care. The hearing was scheduled for Friday morning. That was 48 hours away. "You're trying to lock her up forever," Victor said, his voice barely a whisper. "You're trying to make sure I can never get her out." Margaret stood, her composure cracking. "I'm protecting myself. And you, if you just listen. Rose is sick. She can't live on her own. If you try to take her, the state will fight you. They'll drag your name through the mud. The billionaire who abandoned his mentally ill mother for 27 years? How do you think that looks?" Victor stared at her. The old lies had a new shape now. She was threatening his reputation, his legacy, the only thing he had built with his own 2 hands. But she had misjudged him. He had spent his whole life fighting to prove he was worthy. He was not going to stop now. "You know what I think?" Victor said, placing the court papers on the table. "I think you've been living off this fraud for nearly 3 decades. I think there's more money you haven't told me about. And I'm going to find every cent of it." He turned toward the hallway, toward the bedroom that had once been his, toward the locked drawer he had been forbidden to touch as a child. Margaret scrambled after him. "Victor, that's private property. You have no right." He ignored her. The drawer was still locked, but the desk it sat in was old and weak. One hard pull, and the lock splintered. Inside, he found a bundle of letters tied with twine. They were all addressed to him, in Rose's handwriting. Postmarks spanning 20 years. None of them had been opened by Victor because none of them had ever reached him. Margaret had intercepted every single one. Beneath the letters was a manila envelope containing his father's original will, dated 6 weeks before his death. Victor unfolded it with shaking hands. The will left the Cedar Street house and a modest investment portfolio to Rose, with a provision that if Rose was unable to care for Victor, the assets would be held in trust for his benefit until he turned 25. Margaret had been named as the trustee. Victor did the math in his head. He was 43. The trust should have been his 18 years ago. "Where is the trust?" he asked, his voice cold. "What happened to my father's investments?" Margaret was silent. Then she said very quietly, "The market dipped. There were expenses. Legal fees for Rose's care. You drained it." Victor turned to face her. "You drained my inheritance, and you kept my mother locked away so she could never ask questions." The accusation hung in the air. Margaret's face went pale, but her jaw remained set. "I did what I had to do. You were a child. She was unstable. I kept you safe." "Safe?" Victor laughed, a hollow sound. "You kept me orphaned. You made me grow up believing my mother didn't love me, that I was disposable. Do you have any idea what that does to a person?" For a moment, Margaret's eyes glistened. But Victor could not tell if it was remorse or self-pity. Then she spoke again, and the moment of vulnerability vanished. "You can't prove any of this in court. I've been her legal guardian for decades. The system trusts me. And on Friday, that guardianship becomes permanent. After that, you'll have no standing." Victor picked up the letters, the will, and the shelter file. "Watch me," he said. He walked out of the house, leaving the front door open behind him. He could hear Margaret shouting something, but he was already on the phone with his attorney. "Emergency hearing," Victor said. "We're filing an injunction tomorrow morning. I want her removed as guardian immediately. Fraud, financial exploitation, unlawful imprisonment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, everything. And I want Rose transferred to a private facility tonight under my medical power of attorney." His attorney hesitated. "Victor, that's a lot to push through in 48 hours. And Margaret has decades of paperwork backing her up. The courts move slowly. Then we make them move fast," Victor said. "Because if that hearing happens on Friday, I lose my mother all over again. And this time, it'll be permanent." He ended the call and looked at the letters in his hand. They were soft from years of handling, ink faded, but still legible. He opened the most recent one, dated just 3 months ago. Rose had written, "Victor, I don't know if you're alive. I don't know if you care. But I am still here. I will always be here. If you ever find out the truth, come find me. I'm not angry. I just want to see your face one time before I forget what hope feels like." Victor folded the letter and placed it in his jacket. Then he drove back to the shelter, because he needed to see his mother before the world tried to take her away from him again, and he needed to tell her, even if she didn't understand, that he was going to fight for her the way no one had fought for her in 27 years. Victor arrived at the shelter just after sunset. Rose was awake, sitting in the common room near a window that faced the street. She was still wearing her green coat, even indoors, as if she were always ready to leave but never allowed to. He sat beside her and held out the stack of letters. "You wrote to me," he said. "I never got them, not one." Rose turned toward him. Her eyes were clearer than the day before, not fully lucid, but present. She looked at the letters, then at his face, and something flickered there. "You came," she whispered. "I thought maybe I dreamed you." "No, Mom, I'm real." The word Mom left his mouth before he could stop it, and the sound of it made his chest ache. He had never called anyone that. Rose's hand lifted slowly and touched his cheek, her fingers cool and rough. She did not cry. She smiled, a small, trembling smile, and said, "I knew you would. I knew." That night, Victor did not leave the shelter. He slept in a chair beside her cot, the crayon drawing folded in his pocket, the letters stacked on the floor. At dawn, his phone rang. It was his attorney. The emergency injunction had been granted. A temporary restraining order barred Margaret from acting as guardian pending a full evidentiary hearing, now expedited to Thursday morning. That was 24 hours before Margaret's planned permanent guardianship ruling. The hearing was held in a small county courthouse with wood-paneled walls and fluorescent lights that hummed like the shelter lights had. Victor sat at the plaintiff's table, his attorney beside him. Margaret sat across the room with her own lawyer, a thin man in a cheap suit who kept whispering in her ear. Rose was not present. She had been transferred that morning to a private medical facility with a dementia care wing paid for by Victor's foundation. Margaret's attorney spoke first. He argued that Rose Hale was a vulnerable woman with a decades-long history of mental illness, that Margaret had acted selflessly as her caregiver and legal guardian, that Victor was an absent son swooping in after 27 years of neglect, motivated by guilt or vanity. He had bank records showing Margaret spent years managing Rose's care, visiting facilities, making decisions when no one else would. Then Victor's attorney rose. She called Mrs. Alvarez from the shelter as the first witness. She testified about the crayon drawing, the coat, the question Rose asked every day, "Has anyone seen my son?" She read from the social worker's note questioning the original diagnosis. She submitted the letters, all 24 of them, into evidence. She called a handwriting expert who confirmed that the signatures on the guardianship petitions were inconsistent with Rose's known handwriting. She called a forensic accountant who traced the life insurance payout, the trust fund investments, and the money that was supposed to be held for Victor. The account had been valued at over $380,000 when Margaret assumed trusteeship. By the time Victor turned 25, it held less than $4,000. The accountant showed withdrawals, regular, systematic, spanning decades. Some were tagged as care expenses, but the amounts did not match any known facility costs. Others were simply transferred into Margaret's personal checking account. The paper trail led to home renovations, a new car, vacations, and a small condo in Florida purchased in Margaret's name 9 years after Rose was institutionalized. Victor had grown up believing they were poor. They were not poor. He had been poor. She had been comfortable. When Margaret took the stand, she tried to hold her composure. But under cross-examination, the story broke apart. She could not explain the condo. She could not explain why Rose's medical records contradicted her claims of severe psychosis. She could not explain the letters she had hidden, the will she had buried, or the fact that she had listed Victor as Rose's emergency contact while never notifying him of a single hospitalization. "I was protecting him," she said, her voice cracking. "From what?" the attorney asked. "From a mother who loved him? From the truth that you'd been stealing from his father's estate?" Margaret had no answer. The judge recessed for less than an hour. When she returned, she ruled from the bench. Margaret Hale was removed as guardian of Rose Hale, effective immediately. Full guardianship was granted to Victor Hale. The court further found probable cause of financial exploitation, fraud, and elder abuse, and referred the case to the district attorney for criminal investigation. The trust assets, what remained of them, were ordered frozen pending full accounting. Margaret left the courthouse pale and silent. Her life's architecture of lies collapsed in a single morning. But the legal victory was only part of what Victor needed. That afternoon, he drove to the private facility where Rose was now staying. The building was quiet, clean, with wide hallways and a garden courtyard full of lavender plants. Rose was there, sitting on a bench in the sun, wearing a new coat, blue, soft, bought by Victor the day before. She was still humming the same half-remembered tune. He sat beside her. "It's over," he said. "Margaret can't hurt you anymore. You're free." Rose looked at him. Her eyes were distant, then sharpened, then distant again, the tide of dementia pulling her in and out of the present. But in one of those clear moments, she said, "I never stopped loving you. Not for one day." Even when I didn't remember what day it was, I remembered that. Victor took her hand. I know, Mom. I know now. He spent the next week learning her rhythms. The good hours were mornings, when she would talk about his father, how they met at a dance hall, how he proposed with a borrowed ring, how he used to sing off key to make her laugh. The bad hours were evenings, when confusion crept in and she would ask where her baby was, forgetting that the baby was sitting right beside her, 43 years old with gray at his temples. Victor learned not to correct her during those moments. He learned to simply be present, to hum along with her tune, to hold the crayon drawing so she could see it even if she no longer recognized it as her own. The final surprise came a week later when a social worker from the shelter called. During the transfer of Rose's belongings, they had found a second envelope sewn into the lining of her green coat. Inside was a birth certificate and a photograph. The birth certificate was Victor's, listing Rose Hale and James Hale as his parents. The photograph showed a young couple, laughing with a toddler between them. On the back, in Rose's handwriting, was a single line, "The only day I ever felt whole." But there was something else in the envelope, a savings bond, purchased in Victor's name when he was 1 year old, worth $5,000 at maturity. Rose had bought it with money she earned cleaning houses after James died. Margaret had never found it. It had sat against her mother's heart for 42 years, a tiny seed of hope that no one could steal because no one knew it existed. Victor framed the photograph and placed it in Rose's new room. He cashed the savings bond and donated the full amount to the Harbor Women's Shelter. And he began the slow, patient work of learning to be a son to a mother who was learning to remember him. The yacht stayed in Monaco. The island remained in his name. But Victor Hale spent most of that year in a small rented house near the care facility, 2 miles from the shelter where he had found Rose in the rain. The empire could wait. He had spent 43 years building a life to fill a void. Now he was filling it with something else entirely. Victor Hale spent his entire life trying to earn a love he did not know still existed. He built an empire because somewhere deep in his bones, he believed that if he became valuable enough, maybe he would stop feeling like the child who had been thrown away. But when he finally found what he was looking for, it was not in a boardroom or a bank account. It was in the frayed lining of a faded green coat, in a crumpled crayon drawing saved for 42 years, in a mother who never stopped waiting even when she forgot what she was waiting for. The story is not just about one billionaire and his long-lost mother. It is about the lies families tell to protect themselves, and the quiet violence of a betrayal that hides behind duty. Margaret Hale spent nearly 3 decades being called a saint by the people who knew her. She had taken in her orphan nephew. She had sacrificed. That was the story she sold to the world. But behind closed doors, she had buried a woman alive in paperwork, stolen an inheritance, and made a son believe his own mother did not want him. That is not sacrifice. That is erasure with a smile. The criminal investigation into Margaret Hale is ongoing. Victor chose not to file a civil suit. When asked why, he said only, "I've spent enough years fighting. I don't want my mother's final years to be about a courtroom." Some called it mercy. Others called it a mistake. The question that remains is one every family must eventually face. Can you ever truly reconcile with someone who used your love as a weapon? And what does forgiveness look like when the person who broke your life is the person who is supposed to hold it together? If this story moved you, tell us in the comments. Would you have forgiven Margaret, or would you have let the law take its full course? And if you believe that every mother deserves to be found, that every son deserves the truth, and that it is never too late to come home, then subscribe to this channel. Because these are the stories we tell. Stories that remind us what truly matters.